Good morning, Excellency Prime Minister Edouard Ngrente, distinguished governors, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for inviting me to give these opening remarks at the 42nd Annual Symposium of the AACB. It really is a very great pleasure to be among so many counterparts, colleagues and friends. Consistent with AACB's practice of trying to identify the pressing macroeconomic challenges, I think today you've chosen for our symposium one of the most pressing issues facing central bankers and ministers in the region, which is of course the issue of rising public debt. As preceding speakers have noted, public debt in Africa has increased, but also across the world, as Governor Rwangomba was very presciently noted earlier. This is a post-global financial crisis phenomena, and practically in all country groups, emerging markets, advanced economies, and developing countries, debt to GDP ratios have increased markedly. What is slightly different about the African case and that of emerging markets is that the interest burden of this rise in debt has gone up much more noticeably. What are the implications of this rise? And importantly, how does rising debt vulnerabilities affect the task of central banks? What does it mean for the conduct of monetary policy and the financial stability? All of us here today are in some ways grappling with these challenges. And today I would like to share some thoughts on how to adapt to these new constraints. With previous speakers having noted quite a bit the increase in debt, I will be very brief about how it relates to Africa. First point I would like to stress is, much has been said about how significant the increase in debt has been for the region, but I would beg to stress that there's quite a lot of heterogeneity in the experience of countries. The most acute challenge with respect to debt distress is being faced by countries which were hit by the sharp decline in oil prices in particular, but also other commodity prices around 2014 and 16. These are the countries that have been most impacted by debt pressures. In the region, we have seen some increase in the level also, but it has been part of a broader development strategy to use fiscal space for growth-enhancing investment, for example, infrastructure. Be that as it may, the key issue many countries are facing now is interest burden as a ratio to revenues in particular has increased to the levels we were observing in the early 2000s, and this is the pressing challenge for many countries. As noted, a big part of addressing this challenge on the fiscal side is, of course, raising revenue to GDP ratios. But I would note here that even with some fiscal adjustment, country experiences show that debt to GDP ratios, it's often fiscal adjustment is sufficient to stabilize these debt levels, but it will take quite a bit of time to get debt to GDP ratios come down. As such, high debt to GDP ratios are something which are going to be with us for time to come. And of course, given this, I think it's important that we need to think about how central banks in particular need to address the challenges that this raises. For the balance of my presentation, I will focus on 5 myths on the impact of public debt on central banking that we've seen being aired recently in various contexts. The first myth is that fiscal dominance is something, a preoccupation of the past. This view that fiscal dominance is no longer a problem for the majority of countries in Africa is not without foundation. When we look at the traditional definition of fiscal dominance, that is direct financing of budget deficits by central banks above legal limits, this has declined over time, especially during the second half of the 2000s. Legal limits have also been tightened, And so there is less room within the legislation to put pressure on central banks to lend governments. But I think it's important to look beyond this formal consideration of fiscal dominance. If we adopt a broader view of fiscal dominance, government influence on the work of central banks, this continues to prevail. I should add here that outside the context of high public debt, pressure from governments and politicians on the activities of central banks is not a uniquely African phenomenon. Let me give you 3 examples of how this soft form of fiscal dominance manifests itself today. First, governments are often tempted to put pressure on central banks to maintain accommodative financial conditions in order to contain domestic borrowing costs. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence that point to this, and I'm sure many a central bank governor in this room has faced this pressure. A second example is fear of floating is magnified when foreign currency debt is high. In this context, there is often a desire to limit exchange rate depreciation due to currency and the effect on the second sheet and debt servicing costs. This tilts the balance for central banks away from using the exchange rate as a shock absorber and encourages greater intervention, possibly leading to volatility in domestic interest rates. A third example of fiscal dominance. In situations where economic growth is weak and supportive fiscal policy is constrained by high public debt, the central bank is often called to take a more proactive approach to supporting the economy. This often leads the central bank to provide subsidized lending. This may lead to the central bank to provide subsidized lending to the private sector or to troubled state-owned enterprises. More worrisome still, I think, is that high public debt can create pressure to expand the central bank mandate beyond price stability, as we are currently hearing being argued in South Africa, for example. Myth number 2. This myth that I've seen being aired, as long as public debt is sustainable, its level is irrelevant for monetary policy and financial supervision. There is this sense that when public debt is sustainable, little attention is needed from central banks. I would like to give some reasons as to why high public debt, even if it's sustainable, can complicate the work of central bankers significantly. First, as is well known, high public debt weakens the transmission of monetary policy. In particular, it crowds out private debt, resulting in shallow credit markets and fiscally induced pressures on interest rates. And this, of course, reduces the impact of monetary policy operations on domestic financial conditions. Another reason why high debt complicates monetary policy is because it generates more complicated trade-offs. In cases where there is high foreign currency public debt, and if there is a negative shock to the economic activity, the sovereign risk premium may increase, leading to an appreciation of currency. Monetary policy then needs to raise interest rates to limit depreciation, but this further weakens domestic growth and puts pressure on domestic government borrowing costs. This is always a tough choice to make. Finally, high public debt can create financial stability risks. A key channel in Africa is government arrears to suppliers. As we currently see in quite a few countries in the CEMAC region, banks' non-performing loans have risen significantly, partly because government arrears to suppliers prevent the private sector from repaying its bank loans. Another channel of transmission of debt to the financial sector is exposure of commercial banks to government paper. This exposure feeds the bank sovereign nexus and can generate financial stability risks when the risk premium on government securities increase. African banks have significant exposure to sovereign securities. These account, in many cases, for more than a quarter of the banking sector balance sheet in several countries. A third myth is that there is little that central banks can do to protect themselves and the financial sector. While the central responsibility for public debt management lies with the finance ministry, central banks can also take important actions. These include, first, to continue to strengthen monetary policy frameworks. As you all well know, this includes needing to reinforce the operational and financial independence of central banks, creating better accountability mechanisms, such as explicit interest rate target and inflation objective. Second, I think there is scope for central banks to step up communication on the role of central banks. This means tailoring it to different audiences, making it simple, expanding its reach to facilitate broader understanding of policy decisions and the trade-offs involved. A third action that needs to be considered by banks is trying to reduce the bank-sovereign nexus. This includes reducing incentives for banks to hold government securities, for example, through changes to tax deductibility and exemptions, and by applying macroprudential policies. For instance, in CEMAC, the risk weights applied to member states' sovereign debt depend on their compliance with the regional convergence criteria. Finally, we also see scope to improve debt data collection to feed central bank forecasting and monitoring and modeling efforts. In particular, we think there is scope to broaden the coverage of debt statistics beyond central government to give a more complete picture of fiscal vulnerabilities. Of course, I want to be clear, and we very much understand that there is no silver bullet. All these actions cannot ensure that central banks will be fully protected against government influence. I think South Africa is a good example of a country where the central bank has come under scrutiny despite, or perhaps because of its sound, independent institutional framework. It seems to me that in a world where central banks have more independence, they can also become more exposed to criticism and must redouble their efforts to ring-fence their policy-making role to meet financial and monetary objectives. The third myth revolves around that there is still a clear delineation of roles between monetary and fiscal policy. Before the global financial crisis, there was a consensus that monetary and fiscal policies had well-defined and separate roles. Monetary policy was, in general, responsible for smoothing out the economic cycle and ensuring price stability, while fiscal policy had to ensure public finances remained sustainable. And the objective for many emerging and low-income countries was to move towards this delineation of responsibilities, for instance, with the introduction of fiscal rules and inflation targeting frameworks that we saw spreading in the region in the first part of the 2000s. However, with the global financial crisis, the dividing line between the two policies has become more and more fuzzy. In the past decade, at least in the advanced countries, fiscal policy has gained more legitimacy and responsibility for stabilizing the economic cycle, a role traditionally assigned to monetary policy, which had lost some effectiveness. At the same time, monetary policy has increasingly resorted to unconventional measures that have some characteristics of fiscal policy. For example, the purchases of private sector assets. I think this overlap of roles and lack of clarity creates challenges, especially in our developing countries. It can foster negative spillovers across policies. I have already discussed many of these negative effects that a loose fiscal policy can have on the conduct of monetary policy. Against this background, I think that to the extent possible, the Ministry of Finance and central banks should strive to better define their respective roles and joint responsibilities in macroeconomic management. Any commingling of jobs, for instance, with central banks carrying out quasi-fiscal operations, should be avoided, except in exceptional circumstances and when monetary policy is severely constrained and the financial sector impaired. Let me finish with a final myth that central banks can help governments alleviate the public debt burden. Some argue that central banks can help alleviate this public burden, but I don't believe this to be the case. There are in particular 3 ways that central banks can help alleviate the public burden, and I will go each one of these and note the challenges that they pose. First, should and can central banks create inflation surprise to lower debt? Research shows that inflation surprises can only reduce debt partially and temporarily until debt is rolled over at higher interest rates. And it is even less likely to work in Africa, where public debt has a relatively short maturity. Inflation is mostly driven by supply shocks, and there is a substantial share of debt in foreign currency. Second, could the central bank help improve government fiscal balance by transferring higher seniorage revenues? Estimates suggest that seniorage revenues proxied by the change in the monetary base are about 1.5% of GDP per year on average in Africa. But only part of these revenues can, of course, be transferred to the budget according to national rules. While this is not negligible, it is unlikely that central banks' profits could contribute meaningfully to the reduction of debt, where debt-to ratio in the majority of countries now exceeds 50% of GDP. Finally, some have raised the possibility that financial repression could be relied on. Debt dynamics in Africa benefit from persistently negative interest growth differential. Despite relatively high economic growth in many cases, interest rates on government debt remain relatively low, total government debt. This is partly because in many cases there is a high share of concessional debt, but in some countries financial repression has also played a role, for instance by creating a captive audience for government securities. Could central banks do more of this? Again, this brings us back to my initial points about constraints and trade-offs for policymaking. One important constraint is that financial repression is more effective when the capital account is closed, which is not the case anymore in many of our countries. Moreover, financial repression creates distortions in the financial sector that need to be carefully considered against distortions brought by higher taxes if fiscal consolidation was used to reduce debt. It is also a matter, of course, of societal preference, since financial repression shifts the cost of debt reduction from taxpayers to holders. Let me end by noting that, once again, central banks are under pressure around the world. This is not a uniquely African phenomenon. So you're not alone in grappling with these challenges. But there are also ways of responding to these new challenges, and I think that rising public debt is yet another strong rationale for moving towards a more transparent, resilient, and forward-looking monetary policy framework. Thank you again for the invitation to be here. There is much for us to discuss, I believe, and I'm looking forward to the remaining sessions. Thank you again. Thank you.